On This Week in Enterprise Tech, it's the rise of Stuxnet Part 3, the internet via freaking laser beams, how to out-Bitcoin Bitcoin, why you are going to switch to Linux, and how to explain the net neutrality kerfuffle to your relatives this holiday season. Twiat on the set.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for This Week in Enterprise Tech is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Twiat. This Week in Enterprise Tech, episode 270. Recorded Friday, December 15th for Friday, December 22nd. How to explain net neutrality. This Week in Enterprise Tech is brought to you by Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans. Home plays a big role in your life. That's why Quicken Loans created Rocket Mortgage. It lets you apply simply and understand the entire mortgage process fully so that you can be confident that you're getting the right mortgage for you. Get started at rocketmortgage.com/enterprise. And by GoToWebinar, a trusted webinar platform with over 55,000 customers who have hosted over 2.7 million interactive web events to connect with their audiences. For more, visit gotowebinar.com/podcast. Welcome to Twiat. This Week in Enterprise Tech, it's the show dedicated to the enterprise professionals, the IT bros, and the geeks who just want to know how the world is connected. I'm your host, Father Robert Ballecer, the digital Jesuit, your guide to all things in the enterprise. But of course, I can't guide you by myself. For that, folks, I'm going to need a little help from my friends, specifically Mr. Lou Maresca, who, actually, Lou, let's cut to your shot because I'm not sure what title our TD has given you today. Are you bigwig? Are you Microsoft guy? No, yeah, senior bigwig at Microsoft. Lou, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing fantastic. It's vacation time. It's not too bad outside with it here in Seattle, and I get to be at home, so it's great.
Yeah, indeed. And oh, by the way, the next time we meet, we will have Chibert back in our wonderful, wonderful studio. So it'll be the reunion of the gang. But for today, Lou, we've got a fun episode. Not only do we have a guest who comes to us from the chat room, from a suggestion from our chat room, but we're also going to be giving you a net neutrality holiday survival guide. If you are wondering how you're going to deal with a bunch of relatives asking you exactly what all that net neutrality stuff was about, you're going to want to stay tabbed because we've got something for you. But as we always do, let's kick it off with the blips. Now, last week, FireEye, a security research firm, released their report on Triton, a family of malware that seems to be specifically designed to target industrial control systems made by Schneider Electric. Now, Schneider Electric sells control systems to manufacturing plants, gas and oil fields, even nuclear facilities. FireEye's research shows that Triton infects the gear and then tampers with safety instrument systems and distributed control systems. That combination could be catastrophic, as it would disable the equipment's ability to shut itself down in case of an unsafe condition and blind external equipment that could monitor the gear and activate a failsafe in case of critical situations. Now, the actions of Triton can't help but draw comparisons to the Stuxnet worm, which also targeted specific industrial equipment. In that case, the centrifuges that Iran was using to refine fissile material. But Triton is not the same. Unlike Stuxnet or even Crash Override, which targeted Ukraine's power grid, it can't just be released into the wild. Instead, it's a payload that's designed to be released into an already compromised system. Once installed, it looks for Schneider's Triconex equipment and begins injecting commands. If the system doesn't take those commands, Triton can crash the equipment, which activates failsafes that can cause system-wide shutdown. We are truly in the area where malware has been weaponized. And unfortunately, we're mostly unarmed.
We've heard of DNS, domain name system, right? Well, even though we don't hear about it a bunch, it's a common vector for networks or governments to interfere with traffic. In the wake of net neutrality rollbacks, network providers could use DNS to identify sources it wants to discriminate against. DNS is leaky, and that leakiness adds to the vast data hoard of pervasive monitoring. This is where DNS over HTTPS comes in, or DOH. DOH addresses the issues by piggybacking DNS traffic onto an existing HTTP connection, therefore removing any discriminators. A network that wishes to block access to DNS Resolver can only do so by blocking access to the website as well. It provides a guarantee of both the integrity and the confidentiality of DNS requests, and it helps overcome scaling problems in the DNS. DNS traffic is commonly messed with, and a lot of privacy implications are attached to that. Although DNSSEC allows to end-to-end integrity, it can be trivially downgraded by anyone or anybody, including your network provider, in ways that are not necessarily obvious. DOS's encryption via HTTPS hides the traffic from the provider on a port that ISPs can't block. If a network provider wants to discriminate against traffic, it will be defeated by a little bit of encryption. Let's hope we don't have to resort to new tech to get around network issues, but if nothing else, DOH could help improve the situation a bit and make it harder for networks to do so.
Now, all of our shiny new devices will eventually lose their luster, their fashion, and their functionality with the ravages of time. And unfortunately, much of it goes into landfills. Well, how much? A UN-backed study looked at all the e-waste across the globe in 2016, anything with a battery or a cord, added up their mass, and came back with a figure of 44.7 million metric tons of TVs, computers, refrigerators, phones, tablets, and other electronic doodads. Of that 44.7 million, the United States made up a surprisingly low amount, just 6.3 million. Not small by any measure, but with negative growth due to the fact that our heavy goods market is already saturated. Some of that waste is recycled, but only a fifth at best. In fact, the report estimated that more than $5 billion worth of gold, silver, copper, and other important metals went straight into the landfills. What's worse, the report estimated that the total amount of e-waste will grow to 52.2 million metric tons by 2021. So, if you don't need it, don't buy it. If you're done needing it, find another use for it. If you can't reuse it, recycle it. Or we'll send Burke after you.
Well, you probably heard of some of the bigwig internet companies like Facebook with their internet delivery drones and Google with their balloons. Well, Alphabet X Lab has cooked up yet another internet connectivity scheme, and it's using frickin' laser beams to deliver the internet to millions. The new system, called Free Space Optical Communication, works by aiming two light beams at each other and communicating through blinking. Free space means that you're not only using a cable, you're not using a cable at all, and you're just communicating through the air using a line of sight. If you think the Morse code-like system will be slow, think again. It can hit up to 20 gigabits per second from box to box and will serve as a backbone, replacing more expensive technologies like fiber optics. The interesting thing about this delivery system is it's more of a reality than an experiment. Next year, Alphabet has an agreement with India to bring the new tech to millions of people. If the technology proves to be successful, it could be yet another option in the municipal network plans for local governments to help set up backbones of their own. Let's hope it's success.
For 2 weeks ago, we briefly explained one of the major inefficiencies in the blockchain used by Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, that the processing needed for the validation of transactions that go into a block, as well as the proof of work required to win the reward and the transaction fees, are done by millions of clients, even though only one result will be used. Well, now there's a cryptocurrency that claims it can have the same decentralized power as blockchain currencies, but without the blockchain. IOTA is backed by a German nonprofit called the IOTA Foundation that is pushing for decentralized data marketplace technology. Functionally, it works like Bitcoin, but without a transaction fee and without a blockchain. Instead of a blockchain, IOTA uses a tangle, which is a concept derived from a directed acyclic graph. It creates a web instead of a chain. Here's how it works. When a user requests a transaction, that user's client validates two randomly selected previous transactions before adding its own transaction to the web, which will in turn be randomly selected for validation by future client transaction requests. More importantly, there is no network of miners, no wholesale waste of electricity to do the same calculations over and over, and no fees. Just a tamper-proof, decentralized ledger and an infinitely more scalable transaction system.
Tango, tango down. Well, at least for Google. Tango was Google's first big bet into augmented reality by solving issues like position tracking. How good was Tango? Well, it's essentially packed the entirety of an Xbox Kinect IR projector and a time-of-flight camera and a fisheye motion camera into the back of a smartphone. The extra sensors allowed the phone to see full 3D, which was mostly used to bring consumers a small handful of augmented reality games. Unfortunately, Tango's tracking wasn't so great. The constant drifting and the other tracking errors made some of the coolest apps, like even a measuring tape, unreliable for even small measurements. There were some cool apps like Matterport scenes that turned the device into a handheld 3D scanner, but after a few minutes of the use of the device, it would crash with out-of-memory errors. R-Core is the next generation, and it helps to put Tango to bed, but you'll find a good amount of Tango's code base inside the AR-Core SDK. Now, let's see the kind of hardware that comes out of the Shift and how it stacks up against the HoloLens. Let the games begin.
If you're like many in the Western world, you're probably waiting on a package or two to be delivered. Also, you're probably a little miffed by delays, poorly detailed progress reports, or outright package losses. But before you go nuclear on your delivery person, try to realize that the logistics behind a nationwide delivery service are mind-boggling. At least that's what Amazon is realizing this holiday season as their new semi-in-house delivery service creaks under the load. The Mirror, reporting on Amazon UK's first full season utilizing their own fleet of delivery vans, has cataloged what can only be called crazy not good. Drivers are expected to deliver up to 200 packages each day, are employed by Amazon agencies instead of Amazon itself, so they don't get benefits, are often forced to exceed the maximum 11 hours a day of work, and are so schedule-bound that many of them must take care of all bodily needs in the van while on the go. Drivers are paid a flat rate of £103 per route per day, but often need to rent the van and insurance for £200 a week. Now, this is a service that's in progress, and it looks like Amazon will be expanding the in-house delivery technique wherever they can, but it will definitely need to be fixed so that we're not trapping drivers in the digital era version of the company store. For now, please be kind, because there's a good chance that your driver has had a long, long day, and he's probably wearing a diaper. That does it for the blips. Next up, we've got a very special bite. But before we get there, let's take a moment to thank the sponsor of this episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Now, let me ask you a question. If you've ever gone for a mortgage, did you like the experience? I mean, did you like going to a bank, bringing in a banker's box full of old receipts and crumpled up pay stubs? Did you like talking to a rando and hoping that he or her might deem you worthy to receive a loan from that bank? Well, if so, then just stop listening because I've got nothing for you. But if you think that that experience is out of date, if you think that it doesn't belong in the digital age, if you think that the mortgage experience needs to be better, then like me, you're going to be very happy that we're sponsored by Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans. Now, they understood that the mortgage experience wasn't keeping up with the times. It was dated and it needed a client-focused technological revolution. That's exactly why Quicken Loans created Rocket Mortgage. Rocket Mortgage gives you the confidence that you need when it comes to buying a home or refinancing your existing home loan. It's simple. It allows you to fully understand all the details and be confident that you're getting the right mortgage for you. It's convenient. I mean, that's what we've expected. It's a digital age. I should have a digital solution. It's powerful. Whether you're looking to buy your first home or your 10th, Rocket Mortgage is able to perform thousands of calculations in just seconds. And with those calculations, based on your income, your assets, and your credit, Rocket Mortgage can analyze all of the home loan options for which you qualify and then find the one that's just right for you. It's Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans. Apply simply, understand fully, mortgage confidently. To get started, go to rocketmortgage.com/enterprise. That's rocketmortgage.com/enterprise. Equal housing lender license in all 50 states. NMLSconsumeraccess.org, number 3030. And we thank Rocket Mortgage by Quicken Loans for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Lou, we've got a task ahead of us. Last week, we had a guest from the Institute of Local Self-Reliance who gave us a little bit of hope, because you may remember last week, net neutrality was struck down, as we expected. FCC voted along party lines to remove the restrictions and, well, stop protecting the internet. Well, the ILSR was here to explain to us that perhaps what we can do is we can encourage within our own cities, our own municipalities, the build-out of networks that become competition for those ISPs. If they want to have a market with market forces, why don't we actually give them a market that's competitive? Well, what I'd like to do this week, Lou, if your game is, I'd like to go over some strategies, because I'm sure that you, our Twiat Riot, our Twiat listeners, will want to spread the good word, especially as we approach this holiday season. We're going home for Christmas, we're going home for Hanukkah, we're going home for the New Year's, whatever it might be. to maybe make people understand how we got to where we are, to put away the partisan bickering, to put away the politics, and just look at the history and let people sort it out. What are you with me, Lou? I think this could be something fun.
Absolutely, and especially what the big deal about it is, because I'm sure that my family will ask that as well.
Exactly, and actually make sure you hold on to that, because ultimately, even after we give people the history, they're gonna say, well, why should I care? In fact, Lou, that's the question I'm going to ask you. Why should I care? So let's start with some basic history to understand how we got to where we are with net neutrality. Now, you have to remember that high-speed internet is actually a very relatively new phenomenon. When we were still working with modems and even early DSL, that wasn't really broadband. I mean, it was laggy, and it really lowered the expectation of what you could get over the internet. Now, back then, ISPs had no reason to throttle any services in their network because they were mostly overbuilt. There was no way that their clients, no matter how many services contracts they sold, were ever going to overwhelm the switches and the capacity that they had already built into the system. So, and also back at that time, none of those ISPs were also their own content distribution and content creation centers. Now, this all started to change with the advent of affordable, high bandwidth connectivity. Suddenly, the ISPs found themselves underbuilt. You may remember this. There was that switchover as people started to get cable modems and as people started to get higher speed DSL, where you would find that during certain times of the day, suddenly the network just won't work. And that's because the ISPs had oversold. They were under the old impression that people would never have connections fast enough to them to overwhelm their core. And suddenly they found themselves overwhelmed. Now, they were at a crossroads. When that happened the first time, they had two things that they could do. A, they could invest more in their core network. They could build it out and to be able to handle all the services that they had sold. Remember, they sold those contracts. Or, number two, they could find some way to manage the traffic. In other words, no matter what they sold, unlimited, whatever it might be, they could figure out ways to reduce the demand from their clients on their core network. Now, I'm not going to say it was all one-sided. They definitely did continue to build out their networks, but they really, really did rely on that latter strategy more. They were looking for ways to throttle the network so that they could make do with the investment they had already put into their networks. Number three, when Obama became president, he decided that there should be some sort of regulation, because this was in 2008, and we were in that tipping point where we realized it's only going to get worse. It's only going to put more demand on the networks, and it's only going to become more of a bridge between the services that they sell and the services that they actually deliver. So he pushed his FCC to create the Open Internet Order of 2010. You may remember this. This is actually the first bit that you should bring to your relatives. In 2010, the Open Internet Order was relatively benign. It said, look, if you sell services, you have to provide the services that you've sold. That's really what it said. If you look at that document, at the core, it was just saying, look, we want you to be honest with your customers, and if you're not honest, then we're going to punish you. Well, the ISP said, well, no, we don't like that. We don't have to provide the services that we've sold. So they pushed back, and they went to court, and they said the FCC doesn't have the power to regulate us. And the reason why they don't have the power to regulate us is back in 1934, with the Communications Act, there was a classification system that would take any sort of communications company and divide it into one of two things. You could be a common carrier, like the big telcos, or you could be an information service. Now, if you're a common carrier, you're treated like a utility, like water, like power, like roads. In other words, there's a certain amount of regulation that goes into something that forms the foundation of a society. If you're an information service, that's not the case. You're not necessarily something that society can't do without, and so you operate under far fewer restrictions and far fewer regulations. Well, back when ISPs were brand new, they didn't really know what they were. They didn't really know how to classify them, and the ISPs lobbied. They poured millions of dollars to lobby representatives to say it would be better for all people if we were an information service. And that's what they got, which means they weren't under that title of regulation, which means the FCC didn't really have domain. Okay, let's fast forward. The FCC loses. But when they lose, the court tells them, hey, FCC, you don't have jurisdiction over these ISPs. However, you have built into your charter the ability to do so. All you have to do is exercise a power that was given to you by Congress. And that power is to reclassify those information systems as common carriers, as utilities. Well, in 2015, that's what we did. That's the whole Net Neutrality Act. Reclassify the ISPs as a common carrier. And as a common carrier, it means we now recognize that our society depends on this. We can't treat it like any service because if you remove it, it damages society, which I think most of us would agree with. Okay, now let's fast forward to 2017. Oddly enough, the ISPs have done the exact same thing. Remember way back when, with that 1934 Act, they were able to lobby. They were able to pour millions of dollars into the representatives and say, hey, it'd be much better if we were an information service. Well, wipe away all the political brewings and just realize they did the same thing. It's the exact same play. They've now been able to convince the FCC, we really shouldn't be a common carrier. We should be an information service again. And in doing so, they will once again remove themselves from the auspices of the FCC. Lou, what am I missing? I mean, that in broad strokes, that's essentially the history of net neutrality in this country.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. That's pretty much, the way of the world is that, we try to do a little bit of regulation and corporations feel that at their bottom line. And so they lobby against it to make it go away. And, they twist it however they're going to twist it to make people believe it's the right thing to do. So I think we're at that point now. It sees what we have to see what's over the horizon. Right.
And the funny thing is, the reason why I'm giving you this, and hopefully you'll download this so you could play it back a couple of times before you go to that party, is this is really a nonpartisan way to present this information. This is not, oh, Trump did this, Obama did that, Bush did this, Clinton did that. No. This is just how it worked. Remember, when we first classified ISPs, we actually didn't understand them. We didn't know what they were. What's an ISP? Oh, so I use the phone system to call your computer with my computer. That doesn't sound essential. That doesn't sound like something that if we don't have it, it's going to break down society. Consider that today. Would the U.S. economy, would the U.S. society work as a whole if we lost information systems, if the internet no longer worked, if none of our communication methods were any longer in function? Well, of course not. And yet the same logic that was used to classify ISPs as information services way back when is being used again. And that's, I think, for those of us who have studied this for a while, that's the crazy part. Because it's like, wait a minute, folks, think about what you're saying. If you support the removal of net neutrality, it means you support the reclassification, the reclassification of ISPs as information services. So what you're saying is we don't need the internet. Now, you might have relatives who say we don't need the internet, but I think most of us would recognize, hey, my job needs the internet. My productivity needs the internet. I can't work without the internet. Lou, am I reading that wrong? I mean, again, I'm in my own brain, but it seems to me that most people should understand that the internet has grown past an oddity or an entertainment. It's now a utility.
Yeah, people are dependent on the internet. I mean, if you think about it, security systems are dependent on it. Medical systems are dependent on it. Businesses are dependent on it. I don't have a phone anymore. I have a VoIP system, right? So I think it definitely comes to the definition around the fact that it is basically a utility. It's a necessity for people to be able to continue their daily lives, and I think it's definitely classified as that, and it should be classified like that. And again, if it's taken away or if it's poisoned, it will create more issues with society. So I think it's definitely, I think you hit the nail right on the head.
Now, Lou, I'd like to ask you three questions. Because I think these are the three questions that you might hear from someone, a family member who actually is interested. Not one who's hyper-partisan, but one who says, okay, Lou, that's an interesting story you're telling me. And okay, I want to learn more. However, there's been certain things that have been said about net neutrality that I need you to answer. And the first thing, and it's said the most often, every single time there was an anti-net neutrality supporter, they would say this, which is net neutrality kills investment. The only way to encourage investment is to get rid of net neutrality, because when you put regulations, these companies will not spend money to deploy their networks. Might you have any numbers for us that would fight against that?
Sure. So let's look at the numbers here. So we have the fact that that at&t was invested from $18 billion in 2014 to $22 billion in 2016, which is interesting. The Charter was $16 billion in 2014 to $22.13 billion in 2016. Comcast 7.4 in 2014, 13.9 in 2016. TWC to $4.1 billion in 2014 to almost $8 billion in 2016, and Verizon $17.2 billion in 2014 and $17.7 billion in 2016. So it leads me to believe that it doesn't hurt investment.
I know. That's one of those weird ones. It's like, but I have the numbers. It's like if net neutrality really would keep these companies from investing, those numbers should have gone down, or at least at minimum they would have stayed the same. But what we saw is after all of those companies in 2015, they said, if you pass this, we will not invest another penny in our networks. They all not just continued to invest the pennies, they increased their investments. And when you dive further into it, you found out that once the rules for net neutrality had been established, and once Title II had been invoked, and once they had been reclassified as a common carrier, they realized they could not use the old parlor tricks to hold back regulations, that in reality they would have to compete on service. That suddenly it mattered whether or not their customers thought they were doing a good job. So yeah, there's that. Let's go to another question. This one I hear every once in a while, and that is net neutrality would kill telco competition. Another way of saying this is, oh, but you realize that the big players want net neutrality. It's only the small players who will be hurt by the regulations. Does that make any sense to you, Lou?
So if you think about it, I mean, most places in the United States, they don't have any choices. They have one choice. Some of them don't have any choices. So by saying it's, kind of a strict restriction that they have to provide the service that they at least promise in those areas means that if another service comes along, it's going to kind of force them to do so even more, because now people have choice, people have competition. So again, I don't think this holds water. I mean, there needs to be a little bit more detail about why people think it'll squash competition in that case.
Yeah, and it's always been strange to me, because they ring that bell all the time. You're killing competition, you're killing competition, you're killing competition. And yet, again, those of us who have studied this for years and years, we look at this, we say, aside from some very, very narrow slices of the United States, none of us has more than one real broadband provider. I mean, in San Francisco, technically, if you look at the map, if you look at the FCC's map, I have 3 broadband providers where I live, except the first one is Comcast, the second one is a very low-speed at&t DSL, and the third is satellite. So the fact that they're saying that those 3 choices are equal when there's really only one broadband choice has always kind of miffed me. And San Francisco is more technologically advanced than many parts of the country. In most parts of the country, it's one carrier or go away. Now let's do one more question, because this one is also kind of fun, because it kind of taps into the whole big government does things poorly. There's the argument that net neutrality would make broadband as poorly managed as water, power, sewer. And this is actually a good tie-in, because they're saying, hey, if you make it a common carrier, it will become as poorly run as all the other common carrier services, the other utilities that we use. Does that make sense to you?
So if you think about it, I mean, by making it a very similar to these other services, you're saying you're putting some regulation on them. Like, for instance, how long the network can be down, the continuity of the service, the the reliability of the service, that kind of thing. So and again, these are being maintained by the companies that actually own the backbone. So I guess the question would be back to them is, do you have that problem today, and will you have that problem tomorrow? And with the rules being there, kind of regulating, saying you're not going to have that problem, it doesn't make sense that you will. So I guess that would be the question back to them is, why do you think you'll have more problems when the rules say that you shouldn't have those problems?
Right. Okay, so those are pretty decent answers for the 3 questions you're going to get asked the most. Now, we do need to move on to our guests, because I want to give them full time, and I'm actually kind of excited to have them on and talk about Linux. But one more thing, and this is for those who want to go that extra conspiracy theorist mile, because it does get a little ranty But it's important to know. This is important background because it's the history of telecommunications and high-speed internet in our country. And that is something that I've brought up on Twiat. I've brought up on Know How. I've brought up on Padres Corner back in the day. And that's the fact that, did you all know, speaking of services that people want to receive, that we paid $200 billion for high-speed broadband in this country, and we never actually received it. I'm not kidding. I'm not joking. You can actually research. In fact, I encourage you to research this on your own. Now, between 1994 and 2004, the major telcos were the beneficiaries of higher phone rates, accelerated depreciation on their networks, and direct tax credits on the average of $2,000 per subscriber. That's you. For which they were supposed to deliver us a high-speed broadband network. That was the deal. The government lowered their taxes, allowed them to charge more in exchange for giving us a next-generation network. Now, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 was supposed to deliver fiber coax networks that would bring high-speed 45 megabit per second bidirectional service to 86 million American homes in all 50 states and D.C. by the year 2006. 51 plans were made, 51 plans failed. Now, in the related FCC filing, it was estimated that it cost $2,000 per household, and yet we did not get $2,000 worth of service. In 2006, the telcos came back. So this is after they took the money. They came back to the FCC and they said, well, we couldn't really do 45 megabits per second to 86 million Americans, but we do have 1.5 megabits per second asynchronous DSL to 20 million. That's close enough, right? And yeah, the FCC said yes, which is crazy town. The FCC said, sure, that's close enough. We'll call it a day. Now, just a few months ago, Verizon got off the hook for their promises when the state of New Jersey decided that Verizon's LTE network was basically the same as delivering a 45 megabits per second fiber system to residents of the state. So that's an argument we're hearing today from the FCC, that as long as there's wireless, that should count. So when someone comes up to you and says, why should the telcos deliver to me a service that I haven't paid for? Why are you being such a mooch demanding something for free? You can just remind them it's not free. We paid $200 billion for it. Maybe it's time we get what we paid for. That's my little rant. So take that home for Christmas and tell us all about it. Tell us how that went, because that could be interesting. Folks, when we come back, we're going to bring our guest into the show. But first, let's go ahead and take a moment to thank another sponsor of this episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech. And I'm so happy to have GoToWebinar as a sponsor of the Twiat Riot. Now, GoToWebinar is the webinar platform that's hosted 2.7 million interactive web events with over 60 million views per year. GoToWebinar believes webinars are one of the best ways to interact with your prospects and customers. Instead of business presentations or company websites, no PowerPoint poisoning, no PDFs and spam emails. This is an interactive way to give your content to the people who need to see it. With GoToWebinar, you can create custom email invitations, confirmations, and reminders, or let GoToWebinar handle it all for you with automated email templates. You can display your company logo and custom image on all webinar materials. You can create and schedule pre-recorded webinars that are as interactive as live events. It's also mobile-friendly. Edit a session or track performance from your iOS or Android device. You can create up to 20 polls before the session or do them on the fly for audience interaction. You can also add up to 20 questions to a survey and engage participants with Q&A. You can engage your audience with more than one presenter and a panelist. In fact, up to 6 presenters can share their webcams and participate face-to-face. You can broadcast a view of your desktop or a specific application. In other words, you can do exactly what you need to do. You can show what you need to show to your audience to get your best leads. And with GoToWebinar's reporting and analytics, you're just a click away from qualified leads, metrics, and data to improve your webinars. You'll have end-to-end 128-bit AES encryption and a service that's rated #1 in customer satisfaction. So here's what we want you to do. We want you to turn your next presentation into a conversation with GoToWebinar. For more information, visit gotowebinar.com/podcast. That's gotowebinar.com/podcast. And we thank GoToWebinar for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Let's go ahead and welcome our guest to the show. This is my favorite part because we get to bring someone in who can drop some knowledge on the Twiat Riot. And our knowledge dropper today is Mr. Noah Chelia. He is a Linux guru suggested to us by our very own JJ to the 4884, who I believe right now is getting drunk because he's having his Christmas party. But JJ, thank you very much for suggesting Noah. Now, Noah, welcome to This Week in Enterprise Tech.
Thanks for having me, Father Robert.
Now, you've got an interesting history because back in 2009, you made a point to give up on the traditional IT model. You said, I'm done with this. This is not working anymore. What was the thing that you were rebelling against? What was the thing back in 2009 that made you say, this is not the way to go?
To be honest with you, it started earlier than that. It was I got sick of reinstalling Windows every couple months on my laptop, and I started to look to see if there was a way that I could use my computer without having to continually reinstall the operating system. And what happened in 2009 was I was at a point in my life where the company I had been working for, we had been converting a bunch of our servers over to Linux. And as we saw the increased uptime, the increase in security, the increase in reliability, it really set in motion for me something that, oh, this is a really cool thing. And then 2009 hit, company gets bought out. Company that comes in says, we're going back the other way. And I said, there's a whole bunch of clients out there that have Linux systems and they need somebody to administrate them. And this is kind of where my passion is. And now I have a way to make a buck off of it. And so that kind of kicked Altispeed Technologies off.
Now, here's the thing. This is always interesting. Whenever we have someone who is big into open source, big into Linux, big into that movement, there's always a sense of, well, okay, yes, they're invested in this. Yes, this is a future that they'd like to see for IT. But I think it's important because these are also the same people who expose flaws with our existing systems. Unless we have another alternative, unless we have a way out, there is no way to criticize X product. And that's what we saw with Windows Server. I'm with you. In the 2009 timeframe, I would have just have arrived in DC after serving as an associate pastor in Hawaii for a couple of years. And I remember that it was an interesting time because we were an all Microsoft shop. It was all Microsoft servers, all Microsoft Exchange, and then it started changing. And I suggested a couple of things that could move over to Linux. And it wasn't this, oh, I think we should rip every Windows box out of this data center. It was, there are some things that could be managed more easily on Linux and wouldn't cost us a lot of money.
Right.
It was interesting because it was that last part that actually made people think, okay, maybe I'll take a look at this. What is that experience like for you?
Yeah, so anytime you're dealing with a high-level CEO or CTO, those people are looking for one thing and one thing only, and that is a return on investment on their bottom line. And so when you sit down with these people and you outline their budget and you say, okay, let's sit down and talk about operating system costs. Let's sit down and talk about software cost, and what does your business need to do? Well, if you look at a typical hotel, we manage a number of 15, 16 hotels right here in the city, and then a number of them nationwide. And we manage their IT infrastructure. And what you look at is a lot of the hotel software is web-based. And so the most that they're doing locally is editing a couple spreadsheets or generating a couple of documents and printing those out. There's no reason why you need to use Microsoft Office for that, or you need to use Windows for that. And you can cut substantially, you can cut your bottom line costs down while being able to do all of the same things that you have been doing. And so that's the first thing that you look at is the return on investment. But it actually goes a little bit further because when you start getting into bigger businesses, larger corporations, what they start to look at and start to value is vendor lock-in. If you're using a software stack, if you're using something that requires you to work with a given software vendor or being locked to a given operating system even, those things come back to bite you. And I worked with a medical organization, a hospital, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and they invested in a piece of software that was $20,000 per copy. It was medical imaging software. And they had to buy 7 or 8 copies just to function in their clinic. And then they had to buy 4 or 5 other copies for other clinics that were going to be transmitting these images in. And so the total cost of this software was tremendous. And then the software vendor actually went out of business, and they couldn't use the activation system, and so they were just out that money. And had that been open source technology, which did exist, by the way, and still does today, and they're using it today in place of this a very expensive proprietary alternative. What you find is when you can get away from that vendor lock-in, again, you're driving your bottom line up and you are decreasing your costs. And that always stands out to people that are business owners or people that are in the decision-making role.
Right. Now, I do want to set one thing straight, and that is on the show, all of the hosts, that includes Cheebert, Lou, and myself, we are all pragmatic in our choice of operating systems. I know Lou uses a MacBook. I use Windows. I have Linux servers at home. I tend to be Android for my phones. I have iOS for my tablets. And that's, it's tools. You use tools for their best case scenario. But Lou, I want to push it over to you because, I mean, we've heard this before, right? I mean, this has always been the promise of open source. And I get that. I'm not saying this in a derogatory way. I'm saying I've heard this pitch, but there always seems to be an and then or a but towards the end. What are your biggest and thens, Lou?
Yeah, so like for instance, at work I even run SQL on Linux, so I think that you always kind of pick the best tool for the job, but that's only because I'm starting from scratch, and so I think that's the key. That's maybe a question back to you, Noah. Is when you go to these CTOs or these organizations, a lot of times I see this with business software as well. Is hey, I want you to go from Salesforce to Dynamics, and they say, well, okay, great, but what is it going to cost me to migrate my data and change the database and move where my data is stored and all that stuff? And what they find out is the cost to migrate is sometimes very, very large, and it takes them many, many years to kind of recoup. Do you receive that kind of resistance from organizations when you say, hey, we can cut the bottom line down for you, but it's going to take some time, just kind of like solar panels for you, and when you're saving energy, you're going to have to pay a lot to migrate up front, but again, you'll recoup those costs in a short period of time. Like, how do you kind of overcome that, or is that even a problem?
I love the solar panel example. That's a great analogy. Yeah, we run into it all the time, and you have to be realistic about these things, right? And I'll get people, especially if I go to Linux fests where you have a lot of people that are really passionate and really energetic about Linux, and they'll say, "Oh no, he's the guy that switches people to Linux." And people have this idea that I ride on a magic unicorn, and I snap my fingers, and all of a sudden everyone gets rid of their Windows boxes and Mac boxes and installs Linux. And you're right, it doesn't work like that, because you have to work within the confines of what the business needs. But what you find is that Linux almost always can fill the void where other operating systems leave. And I'll give you an example. So for example, we had a law office, and they were heavily invested in a Windows infrastructure. And more importantly, they were heavily invested in a software system that sat on top of a Windows infrastructure that, as you so eloquently pointed out, oftentimes is very, very prohibitively expensive to move off of this proprietary software onto some open source alternative. But at the same time, they also had this issue where we were managing them remotely. The client is 9 hours away. And so when they have a blue screen or when they have a system crash, how do we get that system back up and running? And so you have these problems. And so what we found is you can run Linux on the metal, and that provides a nice, stable, and secure base. And then you can virtualize the Windows infrastructure on top of Linux and still have access to those same software stacks, still have access to the same familiar working environment, but you have mitigated a significant amount of these problems, and you've also changed the management system so that it's centrally managed and can be done from anywhere with a laptop. Because at the end of the day, if I have a virtualized Linux environment, if I drove out to the site, all I'd be doing is plugging in an Ethernet cable into their switch, opening up my laptop, and using the software to then control the virtual infrastructure. And I can do that from my office here in Grand Forks.
Let me jump in on this, because I often tell people when I try to explain why it is I use operating systems for specific purposes, that I don't have Linux on my desktop. I may have it in my data closet, but I don't have it on my desktop because there are a few software packages that I need for my work. Specifically, I'm a content creator. I do video editing. I do sound editing. And I could kind of maybe do it with a collection of tools in 5 or 6 times the amount of time in Linux, or I could just use Windows. That makes sense for me. So for me, I'm like, yeah, that's clearly why I use Windows. how many times do you run into excuses like that when you're consulting, when you're talking to a potential client, when you're talking to someone who might consider a switch, where they say, Linux sounds nice, but there's X, Y, or Z package that I need, and I can't find an equivalent on Linux. And when you get that, and I know you get that, how do you explain to them that there are alternatives, and those alternatives aren't necessarily shadows of the product they're using right now?
Right. And again, I like the analogies that you're choosing to use. So shadows of a product. If you think that that any company is going to come in and set up a Linux system and it's going to function the same exact way that your Windows system or your Mac OS system did, then you're setting yourself up for disappointment, because that's not the way it works. But if we can take a step back and say, let's identify the tasks that we do, what are the things that we want to do, and how do we get them done? Well, then somebody like me can come in and say, okay, I have fought through those same challenges, and I can show you how to solve all of those same problems. So I'll take your example. Father Robert, you were talking about being a content creator and needing to edit video and audio. I'm also a content creator, and so I have to do those same things, and I also have to do them on my laptop. To add to that, content creation is not my full-time job. That's a part-time thing I do once a week, just as kind of a hobby. My full-time job is I own and run an IT consulting company, which also means I have to manage the business, which means I don't have a lot of time. So being able to do those things quickly and efficiently are very important to me. And so what I have found is, for audio, for example, there is a software product called Reaper, which is very well known in the DAW world, runs on Mac, Windows, and Linux. And it allows you to very quickly and very efficiently edit audio in a very professional way that you get really good results with. And there are some really great tutorials online that let you do that. For video editing, I've been using EditShare's Lightworks, which is a company out of the UK, which makes a highly refined professional video editor that it was primarily designed for Hollywood. So it's designed to be used with a hardware control surface that you can scrub video footage and stuff like that. But I can bang out a video edit in just a couple of minutes in Lightworks, and I can bang out an audio project, depending on how long the audio is, of course, and what all needs to be cleaned up in it, in just a couple of minutes in Reaper. And so, but knowing what those software products are, knowing how to use them, and knowing what the appropriate alternatives are can be kind of difficult, because if you just search a forum or you ask somebody in a chat room, a lot of times you will get the common answers. You'll get, for audio, well, just edit in Audacity, and for video edit, you use Kdenlive or something like that. And those are great products, and they're very good software solutions, but they don't necessarily compete on a professional level the same way that, in this case, Lightworks and Reaper do.
Oh, and, okay. See, that's the thing. I mean, when you actually start spelling out the different alternatives that you have, I think that makes for a much more interesting conversation than, oh, well, just do it this way. Just use it this way.
Right.
I think, but that's a hard sell, right? I mean, someone is invested not just in an operating. In fact, most people aren't invested in an operating system. They're invested in a workflow. And no matter what, you're going to be telling them to change their workflow. And in order for you to make that case, you have to explain to them why it will be better for this new workflow, not just why it's cheaper or why it's better practice because now I'm supporting multiple platforms, but why it will actually make my job easier. Is that something that you're able to do, or do you kind of draw the line and say, well, I can't really give you that cost-benefit analysis?
Yeah, so actually it's interesting. On top of everything you just said, you also have to consider the community effect, right? Because if I'm using Windows and I run into a problem, chances are there's 15 or 20 people around me, both at work and at home, and if I'm in a church or if I'm in a social event or club, that will be able to help me work through those problems. And when you start stepping out into the niche world, especially in the software niche world, something like Linux, those resources go away. And then you add to that as much as I love Linux and as much as I advocate and am passionate about Linux and open source technologies, I have to admit that we have some problems in our community. And one of those is we're not always really kind and compassionate people. When you come and ask us a question, especially if we think it's beneath us, we'll just tell you RTFM, which is not what a new user wants to hear. And I'll just go back to my Mac or Windows. Right. But to more specifically answer your question, yes, I do deal with that. And yes, the way to solve that problem is to become to get involved and to sit down with these people and actually go through their needs and then walk them through step by step and then give them the resources that they need to continue to get the help that they're going to need when they walk away. And there's a great example of this. We actually did a video project, basically. And what we did was we went out into the streets of Seattle and we just ran into random people. And I said, ran into all these people, and I just sat down and talked with them and said, hey, let me show you an operating system. Let me show you how it works. Let's go through all of your needs. Let me show you what you need to do. And then once we're done, let's see if you would be interested in installing this on your computer. And Father Robert, we had over a 90% success rate, because the reality is when you sit down with these people and you actually show it to them, not just tell them, not just give them the slimy sales pitch, when you actually become involved in their lives and walk alongside them and say, okay, here are the things that you want to do, and I will show you how to do them, and I'll show you how to do them better, more reliably, more efficiently, and I'll give you the help and resources that you'll need afterwards, people are very interested. And the thing is, we say that these software are just tools for the job, right? But the reality is, for a lot of people, it's more than that. For a lot of people, we're talking about pictures of their kids, videos of the birth of their children, different events in their life, tax statements, things that are very, very important. And when we lose access to those or lose data entirely, it can have a profound effect on our lives. And so I think in kind of just leading up to what you were talking about with net neutrality, computers and technology are really a central part of people's lives in 2017. I think we need to acknowledge that.
So one interesting thing that I actually see, there's a great organization here in Bellevue, Washington, called at&t, and they do a lot of finance for IT organizations and so on, and their software kind of handles that. And what they're finding is some organizations, they like to pay for peace of mind, I guess you could say. So when they buy a Windows server, Dell server, or a server that has a specific operating system on it for their on-premise organization, they tend to buy into the fact that they're buying into a company that they could pay for high-level support, or they can pay for that peace of mind to know that there's an organization backing the OS that's running it. Is that something that you find where people are just mistaken to the fact that, hey, you can do that for Linux too. There's support organizations. There's people like you available out there. Are they just mistaken? Are they worried? Is that something that they worry about when they want to make a choice or make a change?
Yeah, actually. So the universities are a great example of this, right? A university system, when you go in, they could care less what's running in the server room. They don't care. What they do care about is they want somebody to blame when it doesn't work. And as you correctly pointed out, you can get support from both Canonical or a company like Red Hat or SUSE Enterprise, and you can buy commercial support. But where the deal gets really sweet, and we dealt with this with the University of North Dakota, their chemical engineering department wanted to set up a lab to do these chemical calculations for students. And so basically we would have these big servers in the back room, and students would be able to submit their data into these servers. The servers would do all the crunching and spit out these pretty little graphs and stuff like that. And when we went to demo, the software was very expensive. And so they went to demo the software, and they said, well, how can we test this out? How can we try it with minimal capital investment? Do we have to buy a server? Do we have to buy a support contract and stuff like that? No, you don't. We can actually rent a server from, pick your company, and we can install something like CentOS, which is binarily compatible with Red Hat. We can install the demo version of this software. We can try it out. And if you like it, we can call the software company and purchase a license for the software. And now all of the configuration stays there and everything continues to work. We ended up then purchasing a physical server and just simply picked the installation up off of the virtual machine that we rented and set it down onto the bare metal of the server that the university purchased. And then we called up Red Hat and said, we want to transition this CentOS install into a Red Hat supported thing. And that's something that you could do, and that's something that is supported, and that's something that would be, I wouldn't go as far as to say impossible, but is difficult with other operating systems.
Now, you said, you kind of mentioned EDUs and some other organizations. Do you find that sometimes there are specific parts of the industry that are more receptive to making changes like that? For instance, manufacturing organizations, they tend to sometimes stick with the current software that they have, or the operating system that they have, because a lot of their manufacturing systems work with it. Let's say with the old Windows XP days or so on. Same thing with health organizations like hospitals and so on. Their machinery uses Windows XP, so on and so forth. They tend to stick with it. Do you find it harder, or do you find it harder for those organizations to switch? Or I guess the other side of the question is, do you find it different industries actually are more receptive to switch because they're not as reliant on it?
Yeah, what we have found is that where you have highly regimented and where entire industries center around a given software stack or around a given process, and healthcare is a great example of that, those organizations are very, very difficult. And not that we can't do it. We've done hospitals. We've switched hospitals over to Linux, but it's far more difficult. And the reason is because their entire industry exists in a Windows-centric world, or exists in a Epic-centric world, which is a very popular health record software stack. And when you start running into those are the very difficult situations where you can't switch. But and like I said before, you have to be realistic about those things. You have to have the customer's best interest at heart. And so when you walk into a situation and you look at something critically and you evaluate it, you have to be able to say, this is not an appropriate place for Linux. This is not an appropriate application. Here are some things that we could do to kind of mitigate some of the issues that you're having. But yeah, certainly there are places that it's just not appropriate.
Noah, I want to ask a question. It bleeds into some personal experience that I have had, because I was an early adopter of Linux. I actually used Linux on a lot of deployments that I did at some of our organizations that didn't have the resources of say those that we have in the United States. Some of them were accepted, some of them were not accepted, some of them got it, some of them didn't get it. But I'm wondering, are we past the evangelization stage for Linux? I think we can all agree that Linux is not going anywhere. It's going to get better. There's going to be players who drop out, players who come in, but the core is solid, and people understand that the technology is good, and the technology works, and the technology will continue to improve. I guess this is a long way of asking, what's the next step? I mean, an evangelist no longer has to prove that Linux is a viable alternative, and an evangelist doesn't even need to prove that you have to take Linux. So what is the job of an evangelist for Linux right now?
Yeah, it's harder and harder to find work every day. Yeah, you're right. So what we have seen in the past couple of years is that obviously Linux dominates the server world. I mean, 90+% of servers are running Linux. Certainly in the cloud, any VPS or something like that, it's almost the de facto standard. It is the de facto standard. Where Linux has some room to grow, where Linux has some opportunity, is in the desktop space. And the desktop space is a really interesting space in technology right now, because the next generation of electronic users are not growing up on laptops and desktops like maybe you or I did. They're using tablets. And as we watch the increase of people that are going to Android and iOS devices, and as we watch the decrease of macOS and Windows to begin with, it's getting harder and harder to compete in that desktop space. Now, the good news is, because things are becoming so spread out, because you have iOS devices and you have macOS devices and you have Chromebook devices and you have every different version of Windows devices, because there's still places running XP and 7 and now 10. What you're finding is a lot of software manufacturers are building their software for web, and they're making web apps, or they're centering it in a structure like Electron, which will run on everything. And so those kind of changes have made my ability as a Linux evangelist to go out and say, okay, you can use Linux now, and it basically does everything that the rest of your stuff is doing, because it's running inside of the web, and that has been a really positive change. But you're right, it's getting less and less where you have to really talk about it, because people don't care. A lot of people, they're just opening up Chrome, and that's their life. They play Spotify, they check their email, they do all of their Word documents or whatever inside of Google Docs or Office 365. They just don't care anymore.
We have been speaking with Noah Chelier as the host of the Ask Noah show. He's a Linux guru and brought to us by our chat room, by JJ to the 4884. JJ, thank you very much. It's always fun to get a guest on who's passionate about something, and the fact that it's Linux, double bonus. Noah, could you please tell us a little bit more about where we can find you? Obviously, you host your own show. Obviously, people who are interested in Linux should check out your show. Where do they find you? Where do they find your content? Where do they find your network?
Sure. The website is asknoahshow.com. We're live. Well, our live time is changing. It'll be Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Central. That is, I believe, I can't do 4 p.m. Pacific, I think. And basically, we host a 1 hour a week show where people call in. And I was talking earlier in the program about how you have to provide resources and an ability to walk alongside people so you don't just leave them hanging without any answers or any resources. And that's what the Ask Noah show does. I take my IT career and I give it away for free, 1 hour a week. And so people can call for free and I'll help them with any Linux problem they have.
There you have it, folks. You can either RTFM or you could ask Noah. Noah, thank you so very much. This has been a lot of fun. And again, I'm sorry for the lateness of the show. We were supposed to be taping this 3 hours ago, but I'm glad that you stuck around because, again, it's been an honor and a privilege. Might you be interested in coming back onto the Twit TV network in a couple of maybe, I don't know, 3-4 weeks? I'd love to get you on Know How, our Maker DIY show, and perhaps answer some of the more basic questions that people have about Linux and their anxieties about switching.
I'll do you one better, Padre. If the timing works out, I'll fly to Petaluma and I'll come in studio and interview whatever you want to interview, and I'll try and switch you to Linux.
Well, hey, I'm on Linux, at least in the data center, but you're probably not going to get me on my laptop. I'm just
okay. Fair enough.
That's just me. Noah, again, thank you very much, and we thank you for dropping knowledge on our Twilight Riot.
Thank you for having me.
Folks, I'm afraid you've done it again. You've used up another hour listening to the best dang enterprise podcast in the universe. That's according to 9.5 out of 10 distros. I want to thank everyone who makes the show possible. Of course, to Noah. We love having guests, especially expert guests who come in to bring energy into our audience. But also to my co-host, Lou Maresca. I wouldn't want to do the show without my friends. And Lou, you are a great friend. You're heading off on vacation now, right? You get a couple of weeks off?
Yeah, thank goodness. I'm off starting today, and I'll be back to work on the 8th. So I have quite a bit of time to relax.
Oh, well, make sure you do get that relaxation. Oh, by the way, I was hoping you can send a special note to one of the Twit staff, Patrick Delahanty. He's going to be a new father in the coming months. Could you tell him, just sum up what he has to look forward to out of the first 3 months of being a new dad?
I would say bank on your sleep right now, because the next 18 years will be sleepless. So that's what all I can say is that.
Lou, I can always count on you for the right answer. Thank you so much. Could you please tell the Twilight Riot where they can find you, where they can find your work, and maybe even where they can follow you so they see what you're doing when you're on vacation?
Absolutely. So you can always check out the work that I do at Microsoft is at dev.microsoft.com. I'm sorry, dev.office.com. I check out all the work on Office add-ins and Microsoft Graph, as well as you can check any of the stuff that I'm going to be doing over the holidays and just like the side projects and so on. You can always check me on Twitter at LouMM.
That's Lou Maresca. He's our senior bigwig from Microsoft. Wait, what was the title we had for you last week? I remember it was really good. It was before senior bigwig.
Debug Dog.
Debug Dog. The Debug Dog of Redmond. We thank you. And also, we thank you. That's right, you. Without you, we don't have a show. It's thanks to you and people like you who drop by every week to get your enterprise goodness that we've been doing This Week in Enterprise Tech all these years, and we want to make it just a little bit easier. Please go to our show page at twit.tv/Twilight. There you'll find all of our back episodes, all the way to episode 1. In fact, you can find the very first time that Lou is on the network. I think it was episode 3 of Twilight. So he's been with us for a long, long time. And as long as you're there checking out the show notes, the links to the stories that we've talked about, maybe getting the contact information for our guests, why not subscribe? It is the best way to support the show. It's the best way to make sure that we can continue doing This Week in Enterprise Tech. You can get an audio version, a video version, or a high-definition video version automatically delivered to your device of choice. Again, it's all there at twit.tv/Twilight. Also, why not follow me on Twitter? You're going to be able to find me at twitter.com/PadreSJ. If you follow me, you get to see what I'm doing every week on all the shows like this. This was a little something I did just for giggles. This is a Raspberry Pi, but it's a case that I'm designing that will be able to power it for between 6 and 8 hours independently. Also takes multiple voltages, so you could say do a solar-powered Raspberry Pi, or a Raspberry Pi with a screen on top, or a Tor Pi, or a Pi hole. It's some of the fun stuff that I do because I don't have a social life, folks. I just build things and think of insults. It's kind of my life. Also, don't forget to thank all the people here in this studio who make this show possible. That's Lisa and Leo for letting us do This Week in Enterprise Tech all these years. That's to Alex and Jammer B and to Burke for being our engineers. And always, as always, our Super TD. He is the man on a mission. He is the shark. He is the Kevin, also known as Oh Hi Mark. Now, Kevin, as always, we give you an opportunity to get some redemption by answering a question that comes from the information that was presented during the show. And we try to make it easy. So, considering what we just talked about, in what year did we first do classifications of telecommunication services?
1934.
No, I'm sorry. The correct answer is the right year. But maybe you'll get it next week, Kevin. Thank you very much for trying. Until next time, I'm Father Robert Ballister, the Digital Jesuit. Just reminding you that if you want to know what's going on in the Enterprise, just keep quiet.